Hi, and welcome to this first tutorial on image processing using Affinity Photo. Now, Affinity's been around a while now, and it's proving to be a very popular program. It's incredibly fully featured. It's almost equivalent to Photoshop in terms of its capabilities. And the great thing is that it's available for an incredibly good price. Photoshop users will be aware that the program is only available via a monthly subscription now. It works at about £10 UK a month, and this gives you access to the latest version of the program and any updates that become available. Now, Affinity is different in that there's no monthly subscription fee. You just pay a one-off fee, and at the time of putting this tutorial together, it's about £48 UK, which really is an incredible value for a program of this capability. So if you're put off paying the monthly subscription for Photoshop, the one-off fee of around about £48 is great value for money and gives you a very capable program. You just download it and install it, and that's it, and you're able to download any updates as they come out. So it's a really nice, good value program. Now, on the screen at the moment, I've opened up a DSLR image of the Milky Way, and when Affinity first starts, you'll probably find that it does bring up a menu like you see here. Basically what's showing is the EXIF data, which is all of the interesting and relevant information regarding the camera settings and equipment used to take this picture. So you can see, for example, it was shot with a Canon EOS 5D Mark II DSLR, 28mm Canon lens. This is the pixel size of the image, exposure time 300 seconds, f2.8, ISO 400. So there's a lot of useful information there. Obviously, if you're opening a deep sky image shot with a CCD or a CMOS camera, that information won't be relevant. So we can, for the moment, just remove this off the screen just to give us a bit more space to work. Now, when Affinity first opens, you'll see that there is a great big group of very useful tools down here. We'll have a look at those in a second. And there's a lot of stuff on the screen which you don't need to worry about particularly at this point. There's some features up here which we'll have a look at, and here, and then we'll have a more detailed view of these very capable options down here. So to start off with, there are these buttons. The first one, which is highlighted, which is how Affinity will open, is the so-called photo persona, and this is just the normal day-to-day working of the program. The only two buttons up here we're interested in are this one and this one, which is the develop persona, and when we click onto that in a minute, you'll see that it opens up a sub-program that's very similar to Photoshop's camera raw filter menu, which I've covered quite a bit in my earlier tutorials on image processing. It's an incredibly powerful feature within Photoshop, and likewise in Affinity as well. The develop persona works very well. There's a couple of things we need to look at when we get into that. As we come across the screen at the top here, we have four very useful buttons, and as I'm holding the mouse cursor over them, you can see it's telling us what each of these do, and they're all very useful. The first one is auto levels, and this is a way of allowing Affinity to make an adjustment to your image that in a lot of cases can be very useful. So if I click on this, for example, you can see how it's just altered the tonal values of the colours particularly. So whereas we had, when the image was first opened, it's a bit kind of bluish and a bit sort of reddish, Affinity is just kind of moderating that, which is, you know, quite useful. The next one along is auto contrast, and again it's applying an effect to the image which may or may not be useful, but always worth having a little play with. If you're finding you've got certain aspects of the image, like the colour balance for example, you're not very happy with, it's always worth a quick look at some of these. Auto colours, not really made that much difference, and the auto white balance, this really it's made quite a big difference. I'm not sure if it's made it any better or not, but you can certainly see the before and after there. So just have a play with those. They're quick access buttons, and they work very well. As we move across the top, select all, put some marching ants around the whole image. I'll hit escape to deselect that. Deselect, or you can use that if you prefer. And the final one is invert selection. This is when you have part of an image selected and you actually want to work on the area outside the selection. Maybe you could draw a selection here to keep the Milky Way nice and work on the outer parts of the image. So you'd select this, click on invert selection, and then you'll be working on the outer areas of the image. So again, very useful. We don't need to worry about any of these others up here for now. they don't really apply to us when it comes to image processing. So the next thing we can do is have a look at some of the useful features found along this toolbox along the left hand side. Now I won't dwell on all of them, we'll just have a quick introductory look at a few of them and see if they're going to be useful or not for us. The very first one, I'll click on it, the View tool. This symbol changes to a hand that you can see on the screen, so it's very useful if you want to move the image around anywhere on the screen. It's very good if you zoom in, very fluid, no lag times at all, which is great. It's a very nice, easy way to move the image around the screen. The next one down is the Move tool, and this is when you're working with layers. If you need to move one layer relative to another, this is the tool that you'll use for that. The next one we'll have a look at is the Crop tool, and if I click on that, you can see that what it's done is put this kind of grid on the screen with these grab handles. So there's one here, for example. If you pull that down, you can see it's just cropping the image from the top. Same down here, and we can also bring these in from the left and right, and we can also adjust the whole grid, and that's very nice. So I'll apply a crop here because we can get rid of some of these unsightly lens aberrations here, and then we just come up to apply and the image becomes cropped. So that's relatively easy to use. We'll ignore the selection brush tool, flood select, rectangular marquee tool. Again, if you just want to work on part of an image, you get the marching ants just alerting you to the fact that this is the part of the image that you'll be working on. Of course, if you press the invert selection button up here that I referred to earlier on, you'll now be working on this part of the image rather than the bit that we selected originally. Just moving down here, so the erase brush tool, again, this will be very useful later on in our more advanced tutorials. If you remember my previous tutorials on using layers within Photoshop, I often referred to using the eraser brush tool so we could erase from one layer to another to see the interesting things that are underneath. Demonstrate that later on. A very useful tool. The sponge tool, you'll notice that a lot of these little icons have got an arrow. This is alerting us to the fact that there are separate options here. We can see dodge tool, burn tool and sponge brush tool. These are all found down here independently as well, but if you click on this you can click on any of those independently as well. I'll explain those a bit better when we get to the bottom of the toolbox. The clone tool, again, very useful for making minor cosmetic alterations to an image. The undo brush tool, again, very useful for making changes to just, again, selected parts of an image rather than a global change to the image. So you can use the eraser brush, or the undo brush tool I should say, to just revert certain parts of an image back to a previous state, which is very useful when it comes to image processing. The blur tool, you may use it occasionally just to smooth out a bit of noise in the background. The healing brush tool, this is like a super intelligent clone tool, and it's something I use quite regularly when I'm working on astronomical image processing. Very useful for making minor cosmetic corrections. The zoom tool, I find the easiest way to zoom in and out is just to use the scroll wheel on the mouse. I'm doing that at the moment. You can see once again it's very fluid, very easy to use. And then if you want to revert or move the image back to anywhere on the screen, even though you have the zoom tool selected, if you press the space bar on the keyboard, it changes to the hand tool that we saw right at the beginning, and you can drag the image to anywhere that you want it on the screen. And then coming down to the last few down here, we have the shadows highlights tool. I'll explain more about that later on, but again it's very useful for working on the highlights of an image, so parts like here you see here, or maybe the brighter stars. The shadows area will be the sky background, and we can have a little play with that later on. It's very useful. And then down here we've got the dodge tool, the burn tool and the sponge tool. These were the three that we saw contained within this menu up here associated with the sponge tool. So the first one, the dodge tool, this is really good because it allows us to work on, again, certain tonal values within the image. The dodge tool allows us to brighten selected parts of the image, and we can choose between the shadows, the midtones and the highlights of an image, and it brightens those specific parts. And this is very good if you're interested in bringing out fainter parts of, outer parts of nebulosity, outer parts of galaxies and stuff like that. It's really useful. The burn tool does the opposite. It darkens an image, and once again you can select shadows, highlights and midtones. It's particularly useful if you'd like to darken these sort of dusty nebulae, say like you see in the Milky Way image here. You can see the whole image is covered with these incredible sort of tendrils of dust. If you want to work on those specifically, burn tool is ideal for that. And finally, the sponge tool. This is used to either saturate or desaturate certain parts of an image, and a lot of these tools use brushes to do this. At the moment on the screen you can see that the brush size is marked by this circle here. It's very convenient. If you wish to enlarge that, you can just use the left and right bracket keys on the keyboard to enlarge or reduce that, and then you apply the effect to your image. Up here there are a lot of features associated with these tools. Just for now, you can see we've got saturate and desaturate. These are the options that you've got with this brush tool. As I mentioned earlier on, it can make the colours more saturated or desaturated. So there's a lot of features we'll look at later on that are associated with all of these brushes and all of these tools. So for now, that's just a quick guide to some of the features we'll be using later on in the toolbox along the side here. Okay, so we can just move this image over a little bit for now. And the next thing I'd like to introduce you to is the idea that Affinity uses something called adjustment layers. And this is a form of non-destructive editing where you can apply something like a curves transformation or a levels adjustment or any of the features that are found within the program. And it creates a new layer with that effect applied. So it's not actually sort of working on the original base layer. And in that way you can build up lots of different layers, applying lots of different effects, and it gives you a huge amount of flexibility. So I'll bring the adjustment layer menu onto the screen, and you can see it here. And you may be familiar with a lot of these, for example, levels, white balance, brightness and contrast, vibrance, shadows, highlights. We talked briefly about these earlier on, but there's some features here that will be really useful and absolutely critical for our image processing. So curves, for example, color balance, selective color, incredibly useful when working on Hubble palette images. So the way that this works, let's make an adjustment to the image here using the levels menu. Now, I've spoken a lot about this in the past, and it's always pretty much the first thing you'll start off with when you're working on an astronomical image. So you have to just look along here. Right at the top is levels. Now if I click on that, it brings up this levels menu. Now it's quite similar to Photoshop's in that you have a histogram of the image up at the top. You have a black level slider here and a white level slider there, and you're probably familiar with the idea of this pixel distribution within it in an image. On the left hand side you have the darker pixels, and on the right hand side you have the lighter pixels, and these sliders actually work like this in that you can move this over and it's darkening the image and it's just setting the black point of the image. And this is good because it means we can darken the sky background just to the right amount and we'll reset the image in a second. The white level slider, we don't really ever need to adjust it. I don't think I've ever adjusted the white level slider. It really is just the black level slider. As you can see, I've moved it over from where it started off to where it starts to approach where the pixel levels rise up. Now you've got some options along the top here. Merge. This allows us to make the adjustment as we've just done to the levels, but rather than creating a new layer, it just blends it with the original layer. So it does away with the idea of the adjustment layers, and it just works in the same way that Photoshop does if you're not using adjustment layers. You're just applying a change to the image and that's it, it's done. If you don't like the changes you've made, you can click delete and that would close down the levels menu, or alternatively, if you want to make other changes, click the reset button and start again. So for example, if we adjust the black level as I did just now and then close this down, what it's done is created an adjustment layer. So I can bring the layers menu on the screen, try not to clutter up the screen too much, but now we have an adjustment layer here using the levels slider. So if I click on this tick mark to hide that layer, the image will just go back to how it started off. So you can see how that's working. I'll just take that off the screen for a second and we can apply another effect to it. So let's, for example, try curves, just to give you an idea. So once again, the curves menu, very similar to Photoshop's. We have the pixel distribution here, and we have a so-called tone curve running diagonally across the image. Now it's fixed at the top right, which is the white point of the image, and it's fixed at the bottom left, which is the black point of the image. But what we can do with this menu is we can click anywhere along the tone curve and manipulate it. You can see it's quite flexible. These adjustments that we can make are very, very flexible. There's a couple of things to bear in mind. When you're making adjustments to an astronomical image, what you certainly don't want to do is something like this, where the tone curve becomes kind of pressed up against the top axis along here, because this means it's having a very detrimental effect on the image, as you can see on the screen. It's clipping the data, so that this is a bad thing that we don't like clipping in images. It gives a very unnatural view, and the same thing down here as well. So we keep the black point and the white points fixed, but what we can do is click anywhere along the tone curve and start to make adjustments to the image. So as I'm dragging this black button up towards the left, upper left, you can see it's brightening the image. If I take it down, it's darkening the image. But the strength of the curves menu is the fact that it's quite fluid. We can make very, very sort of fine adjustments to that. So the idea is we keep the black point and the white point fixed, and we make all our adjustments within this boundary. We can click multiple points on the image. So if we, for example, wanted to improve the contrast of the image, we can create a very gentle S-shaped curve. Perhaps we'll go with that for now, and as before, we can either merge to close the menu down and apply the effect without creating a new layer, delete to cancel the menu, or reset to reset it. If I just press the cross to close it down, once again we've now got a curves adjustment layer, so we can see the before and after there, and a levels adjustment layer below it. So hopefully that's starting to make sense. And then there's lots of other things here. So for example, selective colour. I'll talk about these menus in more detail later on when we look at combining RGB and narrowband SHO images. For example here, selective colour, basically you have a drop list of all these different colours here. It starts off with the red, and then you have these sliders. We don't really need to use the black one at all, just the top three. These allow us to adjust the tonal value of the image. Quite arbitrary. You can adjust this to suit your own personal taste, and it's just a case of going through them and making the adjustments until you get to the result that you like. So we could, for example, click on the greens and perhaps just try to address this down here. It looks a little bit unnatural. Not sure how successful we'll be. Let's take this down. Yes. Yeah, that's okay. And once you're happy with the result of that, as always, you've got the three options up here. I'm just going to close this down. So we've now got three adjustment layers on top of our image. Once you're happy with the result of your processing, you have a couple of options when it comes to saving the image. The first one is to actually save it with the adjustment layers attached. And the way that that's done is to come up to File and then down to Save As, and what it will do, it will call up the file name that you've got on the screen, and it will put an AF photo extension on the end. So if you click save, it tells me it already exists, so click yes, and then if we close this image down and then reopen it, we can use File, Open Recent, and here it is, P4814 AF photo. Once the image opens on the screen, we can see our changes, and if we look to the layers menu, here's all our adjustment layers. So this is very handy. If you don't want to save those, by the way, you can come up to Document and then Flatten, and we lose all the layer structure. So it just depends on how you process your images, what kind of files you'd like to save as you go along. It's up to you how you proceed in that way. Alternatively, if you've just made a couple of minor changes to the image and you're not saving the work as you go along in terms of having the layer structure on there, and click merge for example. So I've made a change to the image but not saved it as an adjustment layer, and then you can just come up to File and click on Export. You can select from all of these different file extensions. I have TIFF selected at the moment. It tells us the size of the image, it tells us it's going to save it as an RGB 8-bit image, and then once you're happy with that, click on Export, and it will just ask you where you want to save the image to, so we can save it to that particular directory. It can go anywhere, that's fine. You can save it to your directory of choice and then just click save. Okay, that's done. We'll move the adjustment layers menu back off the screen for now, and I'll close this down, so we can just click on the cross associated with this particular file. Just click no because we have saved the image. Remove the histogram for now, and this time we'll open up a monochrome image, and this is an image of the Rosette Nebula taken with the Chile 4 telescope under very good seeing conditions. This is just a hydrogen alpha component. I've mentioned in the earlier part of the tutorial these different personas up here. The develop persona is very useful, but when I click on that to open it up, we're going to get a message on the screen saying please select an RGB pixel layer before entering develop. Click on OK, and this is because the develop persona doesn't recognise grayscale 16-bit TIFF images. But this isn't a problem at all. All we have to do first before entering the develop persona is come up to document and then go to convert format ICC profile and make sure we change this from grey 16 to RGB 16 and then click convert. You won't see any change to the image at all, but it just means now that the develop persona will recognise the image. So we click on that and it brings up these very useful features along here. We have the histogram at the top, so we're always processing our images looking at the histogram on the screen to make sure we're not clipping that data. It's so important. I'll keep on about it, but it's so important not to clip that data. We have all these different tabs down here. We can start off with the basic one, which is how it will default when you open on the screen. We have an exposure slider. You can see pretty much you'd expect what that's going to do. That's okay. If you don't like what you've done, you can just click the arrow to revert it. And we've got the black point and the brightness adjustments here, so this is quite useful. You can see how we're adjusting the image using the black point slider. We're darkening the sky background, which can be good, but we do need to keep an eye on the histogram at the top, because what we don't want to do is clip that data. So I'm not going to push that any further than there. You can see it does make quite a lot of adjustments to the image, but once again it's very important just to make sure that data is not clipped. We've got the brightness one down here. You can see what it's doing to the image. It's actually working quite well. We're not really causing any problems up here, so if you just decide to take the brightness down a little bit, yeah, that's looking quite good. In fact, we'll take the exposure back down as well. Just take that roughly back to where it came from. That's it, and then we can adjust this. That's looking fine. And then down here we've got contrast, pretty much as you expect. It's darkening the sky background just to give us this contrast reduction or an increase, but once again if we push it too far it does seem to be scrunching up the pixel values in the histogram, so we're not going to adjust that too much at this point. Then we've got the very useful clarity slide. I'm going to enlarge the image slightly. The clarity slider is a tool that actually boosts the contrast and sharpens the edges of the image, and this is a very, very powerful tool. If I drag this over, look what it's doing to the image. If I take that back, you don't want to push it too far, but it's a very, very clean tool to use. So I will actually apply quite a bit to that to enhance these incredible bits of dark nebulosity that are scattered across the image, and also these lovely filaments within the central area of the nebula. So this is really good. That's worked very well. We can also come down to the shadows and highlights slider down here. If we tick that, it brings up the shadows and highlights sliding options here. It's quite subtle, but we can bring the shadows up. If you look in these fainter parts of the image, how nicely it's just bringing all of these fainter parts of the nebula into view. The highlights slider doesn't seem to make that much difference here. It's kind of quite a gentle effect, so you can have a little play with that to how it suits your own images, and I think that's looking really good. Now it's worth bearing in mind as well, if I just move that over, I'm going to drag this history menu onto the screen. Now this basically, in the same way that Photoshop does, it's recording each discrete state, each change that I've made to the image. So if you want to see the image where you first started, you can click right back to the top. So this was our image when I first opened it, and as we made these adjustments, all of these states were saved as we're going along. We come right the way down to the end. So basically we've got the before and after here. We made all of these adjustments. This is where we ended up after applying the clarity slide and the shadows and highlights, contrast, all these kind of things. And we go right back to the beginning. Actually, this isn't quite the beginning, because to go one step further back, we can take this slider and move it right the way over. So this is where we came in. The set exposure, there's a slight adjustment there, and as we drag this right the way over, you can see the slider, well, you can see that blue highlighted area is moving right the way down. Once we're happy with that, I'll remove the history menu off the screen, but it's worth bearing that in mind because we can revert certain parts of the image back to earlier states using this particular feature here. In Photoshop I tend to call this the history ladder. It's saving each of these states as a discrete rung, if you like. But we can get that off the screen for now, and we'll continue looking at some of the other features you can find in here. As we come across to the Details tab, we can have a look at the noise reduction slider, which is pretty useful. As we click on the noise reduction button, the tick mark opens up a sub menu which has some very useful features, and whenever you're doing any form of noise reduction, it's definitely worth zooming in so you can see what the background levels actually look like. And basically have this luminance slider that's set at default when you first open the menu, and as you move this across, it'll apply noise reduction to the image. You've got certain adjustments here that you can apply, like the strength of the effect, the luminance contribution. Again, it affects the strength of the filter. I've taken it right to 100%. You can see it's really smoothed the image far too much. So let's take it back to where we started. It takes a few seconds just to apply the effect. If we come across to, say, about 20%, I'll just let that do its thing, and just off screen I'll click back one step just so we can check how it looks. It's quite subtle in the sky background. It's smoothing the overall image quite nicely. Probably a little bit too much, but if you're working with a small data set where the sky background is quite noisy, you might find this noise reduction feature to be quite useful. I think for now we'll actually back it off a little bit. We'll take that back to about 10%. Just let that apply, and I think that will give us a nice compromise between smoothing the nebulosity and the sky background without making it look like it's been overly smoothed. So once again we can just do a before and after comparison. Off screen I'll just click back to the first state, and you can see the image looks really different now. These few little changes that we've made have really helped to enhance all of these incredible faint details that are found within this image, this hydrogen alpha image of the Rosette Nebula. So that'll conclude our first introductory look at Affinity Photo, and in the next tutorial I'll explain how we can create RGB and SHO narrowband images, because it's quite a complicated procedure in Affinity. It's not as straightforward as in Photoshop or in GIMP, but I'll run through that with you and it'll give you an idea of the power of Affinity for creating RGB and SHO narrowband images. So I'll see you in the next one.